Hello, and welcome to another round of True Ghost Stories. I'm not sure if you can hear the wind. I'm not sure if the mic is picking that up, but it's quite stormy out there tonight, and that seems kind of appropriate really for a ghost story. Once again, the stories I'm going to share with you tonight are set in my home county of South Yorkshire, and many of them not very far from where I'm sitting right now. Once again, all of these stories are purportedly true. So, settle back, turn down the lights, and I'll begin. The first of tonight's stories took place in the village of South Yorkshire, which is located near Rotherham. Now, South Yorkshire is a very ancient village. It dates back at least to medieval times. And the village contains quite a number of old stone-built cottages. These cottages date from the time when South Yorkshire was a small agricultural community. They originally will have been inhabited mainly by farm labourers, agricultural workers, etc. And tonight's first story takes place in one of these cottages, which was located more or less next door to the village church. Now, the church itself is about 800 years old, and it's worth a visit if you're actually ever in the area. If you appreciate historic buildings, it's certainly worth a look. It dates right back to the Norman period, really. If you're interested, you can see pictures of the church online. If you just Google South Yorkshire medieval church, you'll find several websites with pictures of the church. And the tower is 15th century, but the main part of the building, or at least parts of it, date all the way back to 1171. So, of course, a very historic and very atmospheric building. The cottage next door to the church, which is the setting for our first story, is not quite as old as the church, but it's nonetheless quite historic in its own right. It was believed to be more than 300 years old at the time when this story takes place. Believed to be, although as we'll see, in actual fact, evidence came to light which revealed that at least a part of it may in fact have been much older than 300 years. The story took place in the 1970s. Back in the mid-1970s, a young couple bought this cottage with the view to renovating it, to modernising it and turning it into a family home. And the building, when they first acquired it, was quite run down. It was full of character, of course, full of timeless charm, as these buildings are. I'm sure you can picture it. It was built out of grey limestone, obviously quite weathered and rough due to its age, due to 3 centuries or more of wind and rain. It had a slate roof, moss and lichen growing on the roof and on the walls. Again, I'm sure you can picture this in your mind's eye. Quite a pretty little place, but also very much in need of modernisation. So this young couple had bought the place, again with the view to modernising it and making it into a family home. And this young couple, according to my sources, were known as the Tinklers. Their surname was Tinkler. Now, whether or not this was their real name or a pseudonym, I'm not entirely sure. But either way, it doesn't really matter. We'll call them the Tinklers. And so this couple, Mr. and Mrs. Tinkler, were not actually living in the cottage at the start of the story. They were living with relatives while they carried out the renovations. But the story really begins one night about 8 o'clock in the evening, and it was in the winter period, so it was dark when they were both on site doing some work upstairs. There was only a single electricity socket at this point in the whole house, so one single power point in the whole of the building, and there was a single electric lamp plugged into that one power socket. So again, it was about 8 o'clock in the evening when the husband, Mr. Tinkler, went into the bathroom. Now obviously the bathroom would have been quite dark since there was no working light in the room, and he was standing in the bathroom quite close to the wash basin when suddenly he felt a hand suddenly gripping his shoulder, and gripping it really hard as well, a vice-like grip. So of course he turned round and there was no one there. Of course he was quite startled by this, and he rushed out of the bathroom and told his wife what had happened, and at first she thought he was playing a joke. She didn't really believe him, but then she kind of saw the shock on his face was genuine, but she kind of managed to convince him that he'd just imagined it, and he kind of, by the end of the evening, he kind of had come round to accepting that maybe it had been his imagination, although it had felt very real to him at the time. But they both kind of put this incident behind them and put it out of their minds for a while, until about a week later, when another event occurred. This time it was a mysterious sound downstairs. It sounded as though a heavy chain were being dragged across the yard outside. So if you can imagine a large chain, something like a ship's anchor chain, and you can imagine, of course, the kind of clanking noise that would make being dragged across cobbles. This was the sound that they heard. But when they went outside to investigate, there was no one there. There was no sign of anything that could have made the noise. So once again, they were quite mystified and perhaps a little unnerved by these odd events. But nonetheless, they continued with the restoration, and they decided on some alterations to the lounge, which involved knocking out an alcove next to the old stone fireplace. So the workmen that they had hired to knock down the wall set to work, and they started pulling the wall down. And behind this wall, they discovered an old stone coffin. The thing was empty. There was no body or anything in it. And it didn't even have a lid on, in actual fact. But it was a huge thing, and it was so heavy that the workmen couldn't even lift it out in one piece. So eventually they got some sledgehammers and smashed it up, which seems a bit of a shame, really. The thing, from the sound of it, the thing was quite historic, so it's a shame that it had to be smashed up in that way. But I guess there was no other way to move the thing, so they broke it up and moved the pieces, shifted those out of the way, and got on with the job. And of course the tinklers were intrigued as to just how this stone coffin had come to be there in the first place, and so they did a bit of research into the history of the site. And what they found was quite interesting. They found that in the medieval period there'd been a small community of monks attached to the church, and a number of kind of monastic buildings. So not a full-fledged monastery or anything like that, but certainly a small cluster of monastic buildings attached to the church. And it seemed possible, perhaps even likely, that their cottage had been built on top of the foundations of an older building, which perhaps went all the way back to these medieval monastic buildings. So although they had thought that the cottage was only 300 years old, and perhaps the greater part of it was, but the foundations and the lower walls at least may have dated all the way back to these medieval monastic buildings. So anyway, that provided perhaps an explanation, or at least a hypothesis, as to what the stone coffin was doing there. But as regards the strange events, after this discovery had been made, it seemed as though something had been disturbed, and the atmosphere in the cottage seemed to change, as though something had been awakened by the renovations, by the alterations. Frequently the building felt unnaturally cold, freezing cold. I can relate to that, as I mentioned in the previous video, from my own experience of a haunted building, which I talked about in the last video. I can attest to how it feels to be in a building which has this feeling, this atmosphere of being unnaturally cold, as though a fridge door has been opened, and even on a warm summer's day, this feeling of inexplicable chill. So that's how the cottage felt, and Mr. Tinkler in particular began to feel increasingly uneasy. And he wasn't the only one, because the family dog, and especially in the living room, the family dog began to act strangely, and began to growl and act defensively, as though it could see something that they couldn't see. But nonetheless, the couple continued with the renovations, and over the course of the work they discovered more evidence of the building's history. They found old-fashioned plaster, which was probably hundreds of years old, which kind of bound together with horsehair, which is the way they used to do it in the old days. As you may be aware, they used to use horsehair to kind of bind it together. So they found this ancient plaster, and they found under the floor, they found the original stones covered in centuries-old moss, and they even found some drawings on the plaster in a child's hand, which had probably been there for hundreds of years. Drawings of horses and carts and village life as it must have been centuries ago. So a really intriguing kind of find. The renovation work continued, and eventually was completed. The cottage was made inhabitable, and despite their experiences, the Tinklers, together with their two small children, moved into the property. But not long after they had taken up residence there, more strange events started to occur. Phantom footsteps were heard on the landing. Doors would open and close of their own accord, and these things were experienced not just by the family, but by several visitors as well. And then one weekend, Mr. Tinkler was doing some work in the garden, and he started to dig, and he unearthed a number of old bones. And he'd not dug down very far, so this was quite shallow, but he found these old bones. And at first he thought they were animal bones, but as he continued to dig, he then found a human skull. So he immediately called the police, and the police obviously sealed the garden off as a potential crime scene. Police investigators came along and started digging some more, and they subsequently found a second buried skeleton. The bones were taken away to be analysed and forensically tested, and it turned out that they were about 420 years old. So not quite medieval, but certainly too old to be of any further interest to the modern day police. There had been significant media interest in the find, but despite this, no further real information was discovered, so it was never really explained who these people were, or how their bodies came to be buried in the cottage garden. But again, it seems likely that there was some connection with the proximity of the church. One hypothesis that kind of went around at the time was that perhaps they had been criminals who had been executed and not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. And perhaps their friends or relatives had taken the bodies and buried them as close as they were able to the church, to consecrated ground. Again, there was no way to check whether this was true, but that was one hypothesis. But they never really found what the bodies were doing there. But yeah, it seems likely that the proximity of the church had something to do with it. Following this discovery, the strange happenings actually seem to have become less frequent, although the presence in the house didn't disappear completely. And the Tinklers actually lived there for many years after that, and continued to experience occasionally, less frequently, but occasionally continued to experience paranormal happenings. So, for example, years later, there was another incident when Mr. Tinkler was lying asleep in bed, and he was awoken by a strange, unnatural wind circling the room. This, despite the fact that all the windows were closed, there was a kind of a wind circling around the room, which had no normal explanation. And then he felt something pulling on the bedclothes, as though something were trying to yank the sheets off him. And small items around the room were moved and tipped over at the same time. So kind of like a poltergeist manifestation. So of course, understandably, Mr. Tinkler jumped out of bed and ran downstairs and told his wife what had occurred, and she had been completely unaware that anything untoward was happening. Which is interesting, because it seems to be actually Mr. Tinkler who was more susceptible. His wife experienced things as well, but he seems to have been more susceptible and to experience more things than his wife did. But despite all of this, the couple did not leave the house, and they were last reported as still living there some 20 years after moving in. That was back in the 1990s, so whether they are still there today, another 25-30 years later, I have no idea. If they are still there, they must be fairly elderly by now. But certainly they lived there for decades, and seemingly they were not fazed by cohabiting with a ghost. If anyone does happen to have any further information, or perhaps even knows the Tinkler family, and has any updates to this story, I'd be interested to hear it. So please feel free to post any information that you might have in the comments section below. My next story for tonight is also set in South Yorkshire, this time in my hometown of Barnsley. And Barnsley, of course, was for centuries best known, up until quite recently, for its coal mining industry. And the pits, of course, were dangerous places. At one time, men used to be killed on a regular basis. I myself come from a mining family, and I remember my great-uncle telling me the story of how in his first week working down the pit, he saw a man get killed. Now, my great-uncle was not quite 14 at the time. This would have been in the mid-1930s, and of course it sounds almost unthinkable nowadays to send a 13-year-old kid into a dangerous environment like that. But at that time it was the norm. People thought nothing of it. And my uncle, again, first week at work, not quite 14, saw this man get killed, which must have been a pretty traumatic experience for a 13-year-old kid. And all they said to him was, "Get used to it, kid, it happens all the time," which it did. My granddad, who was also a miner, he told me the story of how one day he and his mates were reopening an old mine working that had been sealed off years before, and they came across the body of a young lad who had perhaps been there for decades, and the body was preserved. It was dried out, it was desiccated, almost perfectly preserved, and yet when the air got to it, it crumbled away to dust. My granddad saw this firsthand, and I've heard of other similar stories as well. So death was a regular occurrence down the pit, and because of this it's not surprising that many of the pits were said to be haunted. And one of the most haunted pits of all in the Barnsley area was Barrow Colliery in the Worsborough area. Again, this is just a few miles from here, maybe a couple of miles or so, 2-3 miles down the road from where I'm sitting right now. And this pit had seen its fair share of tragedy over the years, and it had more than one ghost story associated with it. But one of those stories concerned an accident at the coalface where a miner was killed. And the man who died had often acted as a kind of a lookout for his mates. He would kind of stand watch and let them know when a manager or a deputy was approaching by sending three bleeps on the tannoy, kind of the signal, watch out lads, there's a gaffer on the way. He'll bleep 3 times on the tannoy as a signal. But after his death, that same tannoy would, from time to time, bleep 3 times, even when nobody was operating it. And the pit electricians, they checked the wiring and everything was in order, they couldn't find any fault. But the signal, 3 beeps, kept being repeated every so often, as though the dead miner was still trying to warn his mates, or perhaps communicate with them from beyond the grave. Perhaps not surprisingly, the other miners were sufficiently unnerved by this that several of them refused to work that coalface, or at least alone. Another story from the same pit concerned a fitter, and it was his job to maintain machinery in various parts of the mine. And one of the machines that he serviced was a water pump, which was located down a tunnel that had previously been used as an underground stable for pit ponies. Again, back in the day, of course, they used to have horses underground until relatively recently, until kind of the middle of the 20th century, pit ponies were still used. And this area of the pit had previously been the underground stable. By this point, the early 1980s, the pit ponies had been gone for decades. But there's this pump there which kind of was required to keep the area from flooding, and one day this pump failed and the tunnel partially flooded, so that this fitter had to wade in knee deep to fix it. He was up to his knees in water, and he was working on this pump, and despite being up to his knees in water, he was pretty hot, because as you may be aware, it can get pretty hot down the mines, especially when you're working very hard, of course. So he was sweating, and then suddenly the temperature in the tunnel suddenly dropped, suddenly became freezing cold. Again, once again, this strange unnatural coldness associated with paranormal happenings. And the fitter felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, and he suddenly had this intense feeling of being watched. And as he turned around, he caught sight of a shadowy figure behind him, which seemed to melt away into the wall as he watched. Of course, not surprisingly, he abandoned the repair and fled the scene. But it turned out afterwards that he wasn't the only miner who had seen an apparition in this area of the pit. Several men reported seeing a man in a flat cap and a white scarf walking through these tunnels. And it transpired some of the older men who had worked at the pit for decades remembered that the man who had used to look after the pit ponies back in the day had been a guy who always wore a flat cap and a scarf. Was it the same man? Well, it sounds pretty likely. The sightings continued until the pit closed in 1985. And one wonders whether, deep underground, not far from here, again, just a few miles from here, one wonders whether deep underground in those abandoned tunnels, the ponyman still continues to walk through the abandoned workings, even though, of course, there's nobody there now to witness him. So finally for today, another haunted pit in South Yorkshire, this time the Hatfield Colliery near Doncaster. And in the 1970s, a teenage miner was working at this pit, so he was about 18 or 19 years old. He was working alone deep underground when he noticed a breeze that was seemingly coming from an old sealed off tunnel. Now this seemed curious because in this part of the pit it was almost impossible for fresh air to circulate quickly, but there was this breeze, this unnatural breeze. So the lad was curious as to what was happening, and then he became aware of footsteps which gradually became louder, as though someone were approaching. And as the footsteps got closer, the temperature dropped. Once again, this drop in temperature. So the temperature dropped to freezing cold, and then immediately after that, the young man saw a figure emerging from the darkness. He saw the enormous shape of a large man. And again, from the description, it sounds a little bit like the ghost that I saw myself, in that it had no clearly discernible facial features. It was just a shape. But there was apparently the outline of long straggly hair, so the figure was clear enough that he could make out that it appeared to have long hair. And he knew that this apparition was watching him. So he stood and stared at it, obviously in terror, for a few seconds before basically turning on his heel and running away as fast as he could, as I think most of us would have the same reaction. So he fled the scene, and afterwards he refused to go anywhere near that part of the pit. But other miners continued to report unusual sightings in this area. And it was later discovered that about 40 years previously, a miner had been mangled to death after falling into machinery in the same tunnel. And those who remembered him described him as having been tall, big man with long straggly hair. So, these are just a few of the unexplained stories from the dark and eerie underground world of the miners. Of course, many people would just dismiss them as merely superstitions and tall tales, but how many of those skeptics would feel entirely comfortable going alone into these dark, deep underground tunnels, the scene of so many tragedies and alleged restless spirits? And I can't say I would fancy going down there on my own. So, that's all for tonight. My sources contain lots more stories like these, and of course I'll be making more videos sharing some of those, but I'll leave it there for tonight. And if you like my stories, if you'll find them entertaining, and I hope you do, then please consider subscribing to my channel and check back for the next instalment. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks very much.